back to my channel. I have just finished Benji's portrait here and I am super pleased with how he's turned out. Throughout his entire process I've been asked how I created his black fur, how I created the highlights and got that realistic texture. So I'm going to show you exactly how in this tutorial here. I hope you enjoy. So to start off we need to get our layers down on the paper. So looking at Benji's reference here, you can see I've drawn a circle around the area we are going to focus on. So when choosing your layers, you need to look at what different colours and tones you can see within the fur. So you can see lots of blues, greys, almost like browns, very subtly in there, and then there's lots of rich black towards the top of the circle up here. So our lightest colour from what I can see is like cold greys. So I'm going to start off with my cold grey 1 pencil and I'm just going to shade from the bottom area and sort of into the middle. So we start off with very light layers. So that's one layer down. I'm just going to sharpen the pencil. And it's also important that even when putting down your first layers, you're still looking at the fur direction. And with Benji, you can see it's curving over his forehead. So my pencil direction, I've got a slight curve to it. I'm just going to add another layer of cold grey now. But I'm not paying too much attention to detail. I just want to get some colour down on my page first. And I'm making sure I'm looking at the shape of this highlight as well, because you can see that some of it comes up here and then around this area. But I'm just sort of mapping it out very basic at the moment. We'll tidy it up at the end. And now I won't use my lightest base layer, this cold grey one, as a layer for my darker tones because I want this to be really dark. So we're going to gradually go up in sort of a gradient from the lightest part to the darkest part. So now we're going to go into our mid-tones. So I'm going to use a cold grey 3 now. And I'm going to start here and sort of overlap it into my cold grey 1. But I'm still only using a light pressure. And it's important when blending that you do overlap your layers so that they do blend together. So again, I'm bringing this cold grey 2 into my cold grey 1. And now you can see some of the cold grey 2 should go into this cold grey 1, where you can see in the fur there's lots of darker flicks of fur coming up. So I'm just going to sharpen this pencil. And now I'm going to again look at the fur direction. So on this side it sort of flicks over a little bit more where it's going over his eye, and then it turns this way where it comes up in that long flick. Now this circle here isn't going to be drawn as well detailed as Benji's portrait because I don't want to make this tutorial too long. I just want to show the basics of how I draw the black fur. I think Benji's portrait has taken me a good 40 hours. He's taken a very long time from building up all these layers and tones and getting all those really fine little details into him. can see this doesn't really look much at the moment. You go through some very weird stages with drawing, but I think that's what put a lot of people off and thinking that they can't draw with colour pencil, because it's such a long process and you don't get the results straight away. You have to keep persevering and you have to keep going and building your layers and building your details, and it does take a very long time, but you have to keep going and just believe in yourself that you will get there eventually. So I'm just still following the fur direction. And I'm loosely using Benji's forehead as a reference. I'm not trying to draw it completely exact in that circle. So once I've done that, those few layers, I'm going to go and start the darker part here. So I'm going to go in with, I think, the Cold Grey 5. Just sharpen it up. Just so I can get that gradient. And I think a lot of people ask me how I get that three-dimensional look within portraits, and it is all about the gradient. You need to find your light source and your shadow. Because if you think of when you're drawing a 3D object, you always have the light source and the shadow. So when you're drawing like a ball, for example, you'll have the big highlight and then you'll have the shadow underneath. So I'm just bringing this into the Cold Grey 2 again. So it's important to overlap your colours and blend them into each other, so you don't get that sort of blocky effect. And I'm just going to bring some of the Cold Grey 5 into the fur as well, and I'm just going to sharpen the pencil again because I want to get nice thin lines coming in. So the fur sort of changes direction by here. It flicks over that way and then it kind of goes sort of like this. So I'm making sure to keep that within this drawing. So you can already see it's taken a very long time just to build these few initial layers. I think your first few layers are very important because there's a lot of, especially with how I draw, there's a lot of planning that goes into the first few layers. And if I keep my first initial layers light enough, if I have done a mistake, they're very easy to adjust. Like this area by here now, I think it needs to curve over a bit more. But because it's still very light in the early stages, I am able to sort of adjust what I've already drawn. Now I'm going to go in and use, even though it's a very bluish tone here, I'm still going to use some warm greys. I'm just going to use Warm Grey 5 now. And I'm going to build this over the top of the coal grey 5. And blend it in together. And now we can see that this top part is very, very dark. So I'm going to start with my dark sepia pencil. And I'm just going to lightly use it first. But still making sure I'm looking at the fur direction and following that around. At the very top, I'm going to leave a little gap because I am going to go in with just black, because that area right at the top doesn't really have any fur texture. I want it to be very, very black. And a lot of people have asked me how I get my darks very dark. So I'm going to show you right at the top here. So I'm still just using my sepia very lightly. I'm just going to shade this area here. And I'm using light pressure at first. And then I'm continuously going over the top and building it. Because with Fabriano and like many other papers, you have a lot of tuss in the paper. Which, tuss in the paper is like having lots of nooks and crannies like this. It's very bumpy. So what you want to do is you're putting colour in, and then you still want to keep on filling these little gaps by here. You want to really get the pigment into all of it, because I know a lot of people say that they get like white spots in their work, which you can sort of see here. There's still white spots. That's because these little nooks and crannies haven't been filled. That's why you're getting white spots. So what you want to do is continuously go over the top and keep filling in those white spots. So I'm working very lightly first, just to get some colour on the page. And now I'm going to sharpen my pencil. A good way to really get into the tuss of the paper is a nice sharp pencil. And if you're sort of sketching like this, you're not sort of building it up close together. So what you want to do then is use very close together movements to really make sure that that pigment is getting into those nooks and crannies in the tuss of your paper. So I'm using about a medium pressure now. And you can see that it's getting darker. I'm not pressing really hard, just using a medium pressure, and I'm colouring back and forth with very, very short strokes, like keeping my strokes close together and very little. I'm not trying to cover the page very fast. I'm doing it quite slowly. And I'm just going to come around here. Again, not using hard pressure at all. Because if you go in with really hard pressure straight away, like, I'll do it here, like this. In the video it looks dark, but it's just going to look quite matte. And you don't really get much depth with it. And it's very hard to build texture on top as well. I'm just going to sharpen the pencil again. That is also why you don't push down hard straight away, you blunt your pencil straight away. So I'm just going to do the same on this side here. Again, this is still looking very messy and not very like fur, but you still have to keep going, keep persevering, and just know that it will get there eventually. It takes us artists a very long time to get this realistic look. And to get a good gradient as well, at the top I'm using very small strokes again, and then as I'm coming out I'm using less pressure and I'm using bigger strokes. And I'm still following the fur direction as well. And now I'm going to bring my pencil, sort of flick it into my previous layers to start building up that sort of flicked fur look. And I've left this bright white, it's not that white in the reference. So I'm going to again get my cold grey and start working on that little bit that comes up. So I'm just going back to what I was previously doing. So I used the cold grey 1, and I think I'm going to go straight to the cold grey 5 to really tone this down. I'm just going to sharpen it. I'm going to go back with my sepia and start really bringing it down darker. And I'm also going to slightly bring it over this highlight here. And I'm just going to keep going. I'm just going to keep looking at my reference photo and bringing it down as far as I can see that it needs to go. Now I'm just going to stop here because I remembered I said I was going to show you how to get my blacks really black at the top up here. So I'm going to get my black pencil, just going to sharpen it. Now to get it really black, I'm not going to go in with hard pressure straight away. I'm just going to shade those little bits with black. And then I'll go in over again and I'll use a medium pressure. And you want to make sure it's quite sharp pencil so you can feel it actually getting into all those little bumps. And I only use this really dark black method if on my reference it is just black, there's no fur texture. There was quite a few parts of Benji where he was very, very black, and I really wanted to get that rich black texture. So I don't do this in all black fur because it will just look flat. But you can see how dark that is, and I haven't used very hard pressure. I've just kept on going over the top and really filling in those little holes. I'm going to do the same on this side here, so you can see that this is nice and black and this isn't quite. I'm just going to sharpen the pencil again. And I'm just using medium pressure and then lighter pressure as I get to this part, and then medium pressure, and then a little harder pressure just to really get it nice and rich and black. So it's all about just going over the top of your layers and really filling in the tuss of the paper. So that's nice and black now, and then I'm going to go in with my dark sepia, sharpen them up, and sort of blend that really dark black into the lighter dark sepia areas. So I'm using my sepia and I'm going into the black to make sure it blends together. And then bring it down lightly into the rest of the fur. So I'm just bringing the sepia over that highlight a bit just to tone it down a little. And then doing the same on this side, just bringing it down. And now there's big contrast between these two light areas. The highlight isn't that bright. So I'm just going to start bringing it back down. So I'm going to use the Cold Grey 5. And I'm really sort of blending these layers together. I'm using about a medium pressure with this Cold Grey 5. As I'm sort of using a medium pressure when I'm in the darker areas, and then a lighter pressure as I'm getting into the highlight area. You can see we're starting to get a bit of fur texture going on now. And that's taken us about 25 minutes so far to get that far. Just on this little section, so it does take a lot of time and patience. But we're still nowhere near finished yet. So we just keep going. Looking at where the darker tones are in the fur and adding them in now. And still again following the fur direction. And I'm just blending these layers together, going back and forth over each other. I'm just going to keep going until I'm happy with the results. So I think these areas by here still need to come down a little darker. So I'm going to go back with my dark sepia. And I'm just going to keep following the first strokes and adding them down. And now when I get to this stage and we've sort of got these blended areas, what I want to do, I want to keep some of the light flicks coming in, like you can see one by here, one by here, and use my sepia in between quite hard, well, not quite hard, about a medium pressure. You can see I'm not really holding it till the end. And then sort of shading around them. Like this, so you can start to see where the lighter fur is coming and overlapping over the top of the darker fur. So you can see I'm just using lines now, sort of flicking. You can start to see how it looks like it's nice sleek fur strokes now. I'm just going to darken these areas. And just keep reworking the fur until it looks like the reference photo. Now I'm going to start darkening these areas again, so I'm going to use the Cold Grey 5 again. So there's a lot of going back and forth over the top and just keep building and building. Following the fur direction, looking at your tones. And when drawing these flicks as well, you don't want to be sort of drawing flicks like this. You sort of want them to start quite thick and then like flick off like that. And it looks a lot more realistic. And also try and overlap them like this, because you don't want to be going and it sort of looking like grass. You sort of want them to overlap but continue to follow the fur direction. So I'm just going to keep going. And what I like to do with my highlights, I sort of like to go a little bit darker than what is on the reference, and I will show you why in a moment. Only very slightly darker, but with a sort of a medium to light pressure with my pencil. And now to tidy up the sort of lighter areas, this is why I like to go a little bit darker. I'm going to get my coal grey one, which is getting very tiny at the moment. I'm going to sharpen him up. I'm going to pop him into a pencil extender. So he's a little easier to hold. So I've just used a Derwent pencil extender here, just to pop him in so he's a bit easier. But anyway, I've sharpened him up, and now what I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to use him to draw some more of these highlighted fur into the darker fur. This is why I do love Polychromos and the Fabriano together, because you can work over the top. Only very slightly, but it does work. You can see that this coal grey is flicking nicely into the darker tones. And then it also helps with this area by here. If I use it with quite a hard pressure now, it really blends all these layers together. And that's why I like to go a little bit darker first, because then I use the coal grey on top and it sort of blends it all, makes it look nice and soft. So I'm really pushing all this pigment now right into the tusk of the paper, and that in turn is blending all the colours together and making it look really soft. And I do this quite a few times. So now once I've done it once, really pushing them together, I'll now go in with, I'm going to use the Payne's Grey. I use that a lot in Benji's portrait. So I'm going to use the Payne's Grey now to sort of come back into the fur again and get those little fur strokes. I'm going to use it down here because it is darker down here as it flicks. That way, and then it flicks this way. And then bring it up here into the highlight. And you can see now it's starting to take shape. It's starting to look a little shiny, starting to look like fur texture, it's starting to look a little more three-dimensional. But I'm not quite finished yet. I'm going to keep going and keep building my layers and just keep working on it. I think That's where some artists struggle. It's where I used to struggle, is I go, oh, it looks about done now, I've added enough layers. But lately I've kept going with my portraits, kept adding and really trying to get that realistic look. I'm really studying my reference photo and drawing exactly what I can see. And just making sure I've got enough texture now. I'm really blending the highlight into darker areas. So I'm going to go back with the coal grey one again and make sure it's nice and sharp. And I'm going to do the same again and blend the lighter area into the darker area. Now another method I'm going to use is one I've used quite a lot, and I know a lot of other artists love using these, and you'll hear me talking about them all the time, and that of course is the slice tool. So I'm going to go in now with the pen cutter. This is the pen cutter tool, and I'm just going to use this to further get a few more highlights coming into the fur. Just going to use it gently, still following fur direction, and you can see how that's lifting just some of the pigment off, and it's flicking nicely into the darker areas, just like so, and then coming up around here. And I'm not pressing hard, I'm using this super gentle, and it's taking the pigment off straight away. So now I'm just coming around this area. And I don't like to overdo it with the pen knife. I don't want to look too straggly, so just do a few, and then I sort of look and I'll think, does it need a few more? And then I'll add in a few more. I'll add in a few down here. It does work on the lighter colours too. And then I'll go in with the coal grey one again and still make sure it's nice and sharp, just to soften the lines a little bit and make them a bit brighter. So I'm just drawing over the marks that I made with the slice tool. So now I'm going to sharpen up my dark sepia, and I'm just going to further enhance these lines coming in. So I'm going to make sure it's really sharp, and I'm just going to colour in between these strokes, only a few of them, just to make them a little more brighter and stand out a bit more. And I'm just going to use the sepia in a few places in the highlight. Just like so, very gently. And I think that helps to add to the shine of the fur. I'm just going to darken this area up. So when I'm doing dark areas, you can see I'm using very small movements with my pencil and keeping it very close together. So I'm going to go with my cold grey 5 and just darken this area up. So I'm still using fur texture flicks. And now I tend to like focus on a section quite a lot before moving on to another piece, another section of the portrait. So here I'm still really going over, making sure everything looks just right. So I'm going back and forth. I'm now blending this backing because I think it needs a little more blending in. It's all about what you can see as well. And I can see by here, I think I've gone a little too dark. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use one of my erasers. I'm going to use my Mono Zero Tombow eraser. I'm just going to use it lightly. I'm not pressing hard at all, I'm just going over the top. And so bringing some of these darker parts off. And sometimes I do like to use this to sort of further enhance a few highlights. It works nice and soft, whereas the slice tool will take off very sharp details. This one will sort of soften some areas, so it'll take pigment off but very softly. It won't do like a harsh line. So I'm just going to use it to take off some of the pigment and lighten up a few areas. And then once I've done that, I'm going to go back in with the cold grey and sort of blend it out a bit. I think I'm pretty happy with that. Then I'm just going to add, I'm going to use the warm grey 5, and just darken these little bits. Just a little bit more. And then go with my dark sepia. So I'm always working back and forth. Just adjusting and touching up little areas that I feel need touching up. So there we go, that is how I draw my black fur. I'm just still adding a few darker areas here. So I really hope that has helped explain how I draw my black fur. I'm just going to get my book where I wrote down everything that people wanted to know. So I put a post up on my Instagram to ask you all what you were struggling with black fur. So I'm just going to recap everything. I hope I have covered everything of what you've asked. So of course you asked me layering. So starting with my lighter layers first, and you build up to your darker layers to make it look 3D. It's all about the gradient and your light and dark, where the shadows are and where the light hits. So we've got the light here, and then we've made it gradually come darker here. So it's all about the gradient, so using your lighter tones and then through into your mid-tones and then to your darker tones. And you want to make sure you overlap them so that they blend together and they flow nicely with each other. I was asked how to do the detailing and texture. So the texture is all about how you draw your fur, so don't do like lines just next to each other, like parallel. You want to make sure they overlap, and you want to make sure you you flick your pencil so that it's, if I do like a very long one by here, so you start out very dark and then you want to sort of have that, because if you do look at a single piece of fur, this is how it would look. It would be thick at the bottom and then it would come off and be thin at the top. Another one was the colours. Another thing I didn't draw in here, which I might do now, I did use a lot of nugget in Benji's fur as well. There was some warm light. So what I do once I've got my main colours down is look for some of the like light colours that are shining on him, and he did have sort of like a browny yellow tone. So I used my nugget pencil for that, and I'm just going to sharpen it up a little bit. Looking at the reference now, you can see there is a little bit of brown. So I just only very lightly add in some of the browns to his fur, just in the mid-tones by here. And I'm not using any like texture methods to do this. I'm just sort of like brushing some of the colour over the top. So I did use the nugget in his fur. So you asked me how to choose your colours. It is all about studying your photo and seeing what colours you can see. And another one was asking how to make your black fur not look too blue. So I didn't do it as much in this one, but what I am going to show you is how I did it in other parts. So with Benji here, his ears were a big one people asked me about, and how to get them, like obviously I've used blue tones underneath and it still looks like there's blue tones, but how to get them so they don't look just blue and that they look naturally black. So what I did for his ears was I started off with my coal grey one, as always. So if I put some coal grey one down, and then I did use a lot of the Pablo colours. So I used mouse grey, I used steel grey, and there was another, was there another Pablo? Yeah, the one that's called grey. So for my lighter areas, I used the steel grey. So I'm just going to put this down over the top. I'm doing this very roughly just for demonstration purposes, and then I'm going to use the grey, which has got a very nice blue tone to it. So say this was his ear. Say, I don't know, I use my slice tool to get some highlights like this. Say use some coal grey to darken it. But say it still looked very blue. I'm going to make it obviously blue. I'm going to use a dark indigo here, just to make it obviously blue. To say this was like a curl in his ear. But now we don't want it to look blue. So what I do then is I use some warm greys, and I just very lightly sort of colour over it and tone it back down. And even in some areas I did colour over the blues with a dark sepia. So you can see already it's starting to tone down a bit. So you definitely want to use the blues when you've got blue tone fur, but don't forget they're undertones, so they've got to be underneath the black. So then you add the darker tones back on top. So you've still got the blue tones showing through underneath, but then you've got your black, so it's still black fur. I really hope that makes sense. I'm not quite sure how else to explain it. What was another one? So I was asked how to make it look shiny. So again, it's all about using the lighter tones into the darker tones, and sort of the slice tool really helps make it shiny and do highlights, so the nice highlights coming over the top of the black really helps to get that shine. And again, it's all about the gradient as well, going gently from the lighter tones into your darker tones. I had white going into black fur, but I think this sort of helps, but I'm going to show you anyway. So if I use a warm grey one, say this is some white fur, and we want it to go into black fur. So what you don't want to do is have the white fur there and then use your black and say that's white fur going into black fur. What you want to do again is almost like gradients. So we'll keep that there. I'd use my dark sepia to blend these two together, and then maybe like a warm grey, and I'd flick them into each other. But then what I like to do when it is a very light colour going into a dark colour is use the light colour to blend them together. I'm going to sharpen up my coal grey one, and then I'm just going to blend it into that darker fur. So let's just use, say it was very dark fur it's going into, so let's make some black. And then I'd keep flicking each colour into each other. So I'd flick the dark into the light, and then I'd flick the light into the dark. And then in white fur, you don't want to keep it just white like this. You want some of the fur texture. So I'd use a warm grey. So I'm going to use the warm grey 3 and just lightly flick it into the lighter fur. I'm just going to use a darker grey so it shows up on camera. Sharpen it. And I did this a lot with Benji's chest, which I will show you in a second. So that's how I would get white fur going into black fur. Also use a slice tool. So I'm just going to show you with the precision tool. And then I would flick some of the white into the black like this. And then go back with a dark sepia, and then I'd go in between those flicks. So the same when I was doing the highlight, I was flicking the highlight into the black and then go in with a darker colour just to enhance those little flicks for this. So this is how I did it. So you can see this white fur going into the black fur. You can see that sort of gradient where it goes dark to mid-tones to light. And the same over here. You can see the white fur going into the black fur, but it isn't that harsh line. It's sort of like gradually going in together. So that is how I draw my black fur. I hope this tutorial has helped you and I've managed to answer all of your questions. A big tip with drawing black fur is definitely patience. It takes a long time building up those layers, getting all the details in, and you need to persevere through those ugly, messy stages and just keep going until you get those final results. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give me a like. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And there will be plenty more videos to come soon. Thank you for watching, everyone. Bye!